My name is Wombat. This video is incredibly overdue, but even then, I'd never skip out on the obligatory B-roll. I'm pretty sure I implied that this video would be coming out in like January of 2023, which obviously was a little while ago, and I'll put more in a video about what happened there at another point in time, but the TLDR is my life and business as a freelance artist took up to the point where I couldn't commit the time I wanted to these videos, and not wanting to half-ass them, I simply put them on hold. But the show must go on, but here we are anyway, let's get a move on. Truth be told, I ummed and ahed about whether or not to do this video at all. Should I start it from scratch? Should I pick up from where I was? Should I just scrap the whole video? But in the end, I decided that these thoughts were my honest thoughts after I'd held the camera for a couple of weeks and put my thoughts onto paper, and I didn't want to redo that after not playing with the camera for a while. I wanted to commit my honest thoughts to camera, because at the end of the day, I'm here making this channel because I love cameras and I want to share these thoughts. To be clear, this script was about 90% finished when I left it a bit over a year and a half ago. So I picked it up, added in the little things that needed, which I've noted, such as this intro and a little bit at the end. However, I've kept everything as is when I wrote it. This does also mean some of the technical and pricing comments may be slightly out of date, but I also don't think they've changed too much having a read over and looking around the market. However, without any further ado, let's get into the actual review. If you're new here, I break these videos down in sections, and you can jump to any section any time, by the way. Simply use the bar down below or any of the links I put in the description. What we'll be looking at today is who am I, the basics of the camera, or what's advertised, the technical, which will split into the sensor and the processor, videography, photography, interfacing, my overall thoughts, and of course, a quick summary. So, who am I? If you're not familiar with that question, then you probably haven't checked out my other videos, which you absolutely should, by the way, and yes, that's a plug. I originally trained as both an actor and a stunt performer and spent almost 10 years working in front of the camera before several years ago, I decided I wanted to make films more than I wanted to be in them. So, skip a few years of film school, add in some short and feature film credits, and here I am on YouTube trying to make it as a content creator. But onto the main contender. What about this camera? The Sony A7iii, or A7iii, or whatever your preferred pronunciation is a 35mm censored mirrorless camera currently advertised at about 2,700 Australian dollar dues and going second-hand for as low as $1,300. Sony advertised dramatically enhanced image quality, high-performance autofocus, and a bunch of other things that we'll get into in the technical part of this video. They also boast about an impressive 15 stops of dynamic range, which is more than the cinema camera that I reviewed last month, or rather, about 2 years ago now. Most importantly, according to Sony, it's reliable. We know this because Sony used the word reliable no less than 6 times on the website for this camera. Wonder if they're compensating for something. I mean, if you compared their sensor to the size of other cameras I'd reviewed, you'd certainly think so. But speaking of, let's dive into the technical part 1, the sensor. The 35mm CMOS sensor is 35.6mm by 23.8mm, and you'll probably notice that's a lot bigger than the last few cameras that I reviewed. When compared to my daily driver, the GH5, actually I just bought a new daily driver, review coming soon, make sure you get subscribed, it quite literally looks about 4 times the size. So, what do you get for all this extra space? As it turns out, only about 4 extra megapixels. But as Microsoft tried to convince us all back in 2013, megapixels aren't everything. For your larger sensor, you also get clearer, sharper images, a shallower depth of field, as I mentioned above, 15 stops of dynamic range, and my personal favorite, increased low light performance. It's also capable of delivering 4K video and uses Sony's E-mount sensor, which means there is an abundance of lenses secondhand and new from everywhere from the emerging to professional market, including this 85mm f1.8 lens that I bought brand new at $400 dues and shot a fair amount of this review on. But it's all well and good to have a great sensor. How well is it actually utilized? The technical part 2, the processor. The XMOX R sensor on the Sony A7 III is backed up by their Bion ZX processor. And honestly, it's not bad. The sensor can process up to 10 images per second when shooting raw photography and up to 120 frames per second in HD video with a varying bitrate from 16 to 100 megabytes per second. It can also jump up to 4K 30 frames a second where it delivers between 60 and 100 megabytes per second depending on your exact settings and whether or not you're set to PAL. but we'll touch more on that later. But resolution is only half the processor's job. What about all the other ease of life features I find myself asking? And boy, am I glad I did. Coming off a cinema camera, it is so good to come back to a camera that actually has autofocus, let alone inbuilt stabilization. This is particularly important depending on your project, as you may not have the ability to manual focus, or maybe you're shooting something in the style of a vlog, like this. The autofocus on the Sony was pretty quick and reasonably accurate, at least during the daytime. We'll touch on night in a second. If it didn't nail the shot, I often found that simply centering the target, getting my focus with a half click, and then moving the camera to the side was enough to make sure that I had focus through a take. Of course, none of that applies when you get to nighttime. Whilst this camera would sometimes absolutely nail photography or videos during the night, a lot of the time I'd describe it as inconsistent at best. The processor also offers a pretty respectable in-body stabilization, something that cannot be overstated if you're looking for an everyday shooter. Now, to be clear, it's not going to be as good as if you had a gimbal or a proper handheld rig, but it does mean that footage is just usable when you hold it with your hands, which cannot be overstated if you just want a camera to throw in your bag and not have to bring a bunch of gear for. Despite all that impressive functionality, I found that a single battery could last most of the day for this camera, whether I was shooting photos or videos. That said, it takes a long time to charge. Like we're talking plug it in overnight long. So if you do plan on investing in this camera, make sure you get a couple of batteries so that on the instances where you do need an extra one, you don't have to wait an entire night until you get your charge back. The camera is also fairly lightweight, which means at the end of the day, I can throw this thing in my bag, not worry about packing a gimbal, not feel the weight on my back, and not even have a sore arm after an entire day of shooting. It's pretty good. But getting caught up in the math and technical mumbo jumbo isn't what camera is about. So let's explore what this thing is like in the real world. Videography. The A7iii sensor is fantastic for shooting HD video. At up to 100 frames per second, the footage is smooth, clear, and just diversely usable. And by that, I mean you can shoot this camera anytime, any place, and the footage you get out of it is going to be usable anywhere from social media to, in one of my clients' cases, TV advertisement. I'm not sure I'd recommend it for a feature film. For something like that, you'd probably want a camera that can shoot RAW, but that's a topic for a different video. Paired with a reasonably quick autofocus and great in-body stabilization, this camera has everything you need for an everyday shooter when shooting HD videos. The footage is what you need, it can go to a standard SD card, and otherwise just works once the settings are dialed in. More importantly, I just really like the footage that came out of it. For everything from daylight to naked flames at midnight, the dynamic range in this camera meant I was just able to capture everything without blowing out the sensor or underexposing it, and the color science that Sony brings really highlights the videos. I cannot over-exaggerate how much I enjoyed the footage from this camera. Swapping over to 4K, honestly, it's not bad. I mean, the autofocus is slower, but that's something that you'd expect even on a camera that came out today. Now you might be thinking, earlier in the video didn't he say this camera was advertised for HD 120 and 4K 30? And yes, however, it depends on your region settings, which is something I'm going to get into more in the interface section, but the TLDR is that your region settings decides what frame rates you can shoot at. So you can't actually use everything that's advertised in this camera in one setting. You have to restart the camera because when you change region, the camera has to completely turn on and off, and getting to that setting is a completely different story. But I don't want to spoil too much of that now, so let's keep going. Another problem I had with this camera is that it completely flipped out when I connected it to my gimbal. Now to be clear, this is a sample size of 1, so I don't know if this is an issue that's common with this camera or if it was just something to do with my model, but anytime I tried to connect it to a gimbal, be it mine or a friend's, it completely flipped out, refused to even turn off when I switched it off, and the only way I could fix it was to take the battery out, let all the residual electricity drain out of the camera, put the battery back on, and turn it back on. There was simply a no-go for use with gimbals. Obviously your mileage may vary, and if you don't run a gimbal, then that's not a problem for you. It also probably won't be an issue if you're only looking at this camera for stills. Speaking of, let's get into photography. Once again, jumping from my daily driver being an MFT sensor to the A7iii, it was amazing to shoot stills with this camera. The autofocus in stills mode is pretty sharp and pretty accurate. The amount of dynamic range that 15 stops nets you is just incredible. Really, there's not a lot for me to criticize in this section. I genuinely enjoyed shooting with this camera. Well, outside of its low light autofocus performance, but you can't have everything at this price point. The camera is light enough that I didn't notice it on my back or have a tired arm after a few hours of shooting. Now, I've been shooting on Micro Four Thirds for about 6 years, and honestly, I don't think anything that I shot would have turned out as good if I'd used any of my Micro Four Thirds cameras. The A7iii sensor combined with the processor in this was just amazing. One thing that did throw me a little was to shoot in Sony's native color log profile, I had to be locked into an ISO of 800. Now, I'm never against going for a native ISO only, but in photography, I will admit I do fluctuate a little, and it was just an interesting one for me that I couldn't change my ISO just to use a certain color science. It does mean that it locks you into a certain amount of motion blur unless you want to buy an ND filter, because your shutter is about the only thing you have left to adjust your exposure, assuming you don't want to change your depth of field. But now that we know that Sony pretty much nailed photography, let's have a look at the camera's interface. The interface. Full disclosure, this part of the script wasn't completely finished when I put the script down about a year and a half ago, so this is a mix of my original thoughts and some of my modern writing. For every credit the Sony A7 III scored, to me, the interface just managed to claw it back. It's clunky, unfriendly, and especially if you want to look at even the current purchase new price, for me, it's somewhere between unacceptable and insulting. My previous review, the Blackmagic Pocket 4K, is probably the best user interface I've ever used, and that's not even just talking cameras. I was able to find anything that I needed in less than a minute, even though I'd never read the user manual, and I can navigate to any setting I need generally in less than 3 presses of a button. The UI was also large, easy to navigate, and had a very simple interface. This, keep in mind, is a camera that was announced a year before this Sony and cost half as much. The Sony A7 III, on the other hand, is just the total opposite. Navigating the menu is horrible. It can take you minutes to find things, and just because you found a setting, that also doesn't mean you can change it. I'm going to talk more about my favorite example being the frame rate caps, because it really insults me. As I mentioned earlier, Sony locks the frame rate of this camera to the region that you set it in. Meaning that if you're shooting a native 25 frames per second and you want to take advantage of the advertised 120 frames per second in HD, you need to change your region to do so, which requires going through this ridiculous to navigate menu and having the entire camera reset. Now to me, that's not acceptable for a camera that's almost $3,000 brand new, just because Sony doesn't seem to think that we, as people paying that much for a camera, don't understand how refresh rates work with lighting. The fact is, Sony advertised this camera as being 30 frames a second in 4K and 120 frames a second in HD, and made it technically possible, but ridiculously unviable to do in a practical shooting sense. And that really sums up the user interface for me. Nothing about it is user-friendly, and nothing about it makes me enjoy interacting with the camera. Which is a problem, because I love shooting with it, but I hated having to go into the settings and change literally anything outside of about the aperture. Honestly, I don't think there's a single redeemable feature about this camera's user interface, and that's also probably the cleanest summary I can give you of the UI. But speaking of summaries, let's get into my overall thoughts. The Sony A7 III, or however you prefer to pronounce it, is a really solid camera. It may be about 3,000 U, but it goes for as low as 1,300 secondhand, although more often between 1,500 and 1,800. If we stick to that secondhand price point, it's a phenomenal sensor with a processor that honestly, at this price point, backs it up really well. It may not be perfect for autofocus in low light, but it does every other situation well enough that if it weren't for the interface, I would have serious concerns about whether or not I swap this camera out for what was my everyday shooter, the GH5, and that was my everyday shooter for about 4 years. To be clear, it's also got a bit of competition in this price point, but I don't think it would be unfair to say that it manages to hold its own in that price point. It may not be the best, but it does do things better than other cameras, and it has advantages that others don't. Whilst I may have had issues connecting to my Ronin, and of course the issues with low light autofocus, overall, I loved using this sensor, and I found the processor backed it up reasonably well at this price point that I'd be happy with it. More than that, this buys you into the Sony ecosystem, an ecosystem that, to this year, still has Oscar-nominated films in it. You're talking about a camera system you can buy into and keep your lenses and accessories everywhere from your starting career up until literally making it to the Oscars. It's an invaluable experience to not have to shift everything you own, all your accessories, all your lenses out for a different body and camera type. The truth is, whilst I considered swapping this for my GH5 due to the sensor mainly, I never really would have gone through with it. From the moment I started interacting with it, I knew I didn't like it, and I tried to put that on hold, I really did. I said to myself, this is a phenomenal upgrade on the Micro Four Thirds sensor. Just give it a chance and see if you get used to it. But the reality is it got worse and worse and frustrated me more and more and more. And at the end of the day, I simply cannot in good conscience recommend this camera, even though it's ticked so many boxes for me to want to love it. A quick summary. At the end of the day, the Sony A7iii has a great sensor, a pretty solid processor, and can be picked up for a little over $1,000 Australian dollars if you're a thrifty shopper. The footage can easily be uploaded to YouTube, Instagram, or even TV advertisement without raising any eyebrows because the footage looks good. But I hate interacting with it. Look, if you're a film student or otherwise just starting out in video or photography, this is probably a really good purchase. It's not that expensive compared to what else is on the market, and it buys into the Sony ecosystem, meaning you never have to swap out your lenses and accessories. As someone who's just gone through an ecosystem move, I cannot emphasize how valuable that is. But what I can say is that if you buy this camera, the day will come where you interact with a camera that is actually user-friendly, and you will probably never want to touch this thing again. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that at least half as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, or if you otherwise found it helpful, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. It takes a few seconds out of your day and it really helps to make mine. If you're looking forward to the next one, make sure you hit that subscribe button. I'll do my best to make sure that the next gap isn't another 2-year.